Rise and shine, my sinners. When Father Evil starts his day, he gets a little deadly. Deadly Grounds coffee has the richest, smoothest flavor you'll find anywhere. It's sinfully delicious. Once you go deadly, you never go back. Order yours at getdeadly.com. Coffee's so good, it's scary.
What kind of a sick school is this?
Uh-oh, Dongo!
Strange things are afoot at the Circle K.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
You got spunk. I hate spunk.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger.
Oh, righty then.
How you doing? Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
Say hello to my little friend!
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
What are you people? On dope?
Stop whining.
I got a crap on deck that can choke a donkey.
Who is your daddy?
I'm sorry, but all questions must be submitted in writing.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Can I do that?
I'll be back.
A dynamite! Show me the money!
Don't! Up your nose when you have a hole.
A what?
I'm sailing! I'm sailing!
You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Love means never having to say you're sorry.
Here's looking at you, kid.
We got no food, we got no jobs, our pets' heads are falling off!
Come on to the coast and get together, have a few laughs.
Hear that, Elizabeth? I'm coming to join you, honey!
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV.
I love it when a plan comes together.
What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to
11, exactly. One louder.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
We're on a mission from God.
Hello and welcome to another fun-filled episode of Then Is Now podcast. I am your host, Rigor. As many listeners already know, we strive on this show to present cool pop culture of the past to a new generation who may have missed out on those things. Comic books have been around for the last 90 years or so and are still going strong. Most modern audiences are familiar with the Marvel and DC movies that have been popular for the last decade, as well as the various superhero shows on TV and on streaming services. Comic books are one thing that have never left the zeitgeist and remain a large part of our pop culture. On our show today, we're going to talk with an amazing comic book writer who has been plying his trade since 1990. Joining me as co-host will be comic book guru Justin Cooper, who last joined me on the show in which we discussed The Crisis on Infinite Earths. So sit back and enjoy our interview as we discuss the amazing career of one of the modern era's most prolific comic book writers. Class is in session.
I have a bad feeling about this.
How could I possibly be expected to handle school on a day like this?
Food fight!
Hey, you in my class?
I am today.
I think you should consider transferring to shop class. Now, very few students are severely injured in shop class.
Bueller.
When you were in school,
Bueller.
did you ever cut class?
Bueller. Yeah, I guess I did. Sure, most kids cut classes.
Good, sign this. He's sick.
I get so lonely when I hear that third attendance bell ring and all my kids are not here.
7 years of college down the drain.
Fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son.
You lack discipline.
As long as I'm here, there will be no grades or gold stars or demerits. We're gonna have recess all the time. Woo! Go, play, and have fun now!
Okay, folks, as I mentioned in the original intro, we've got a special guest today. And joining me as co-host once again is fellow podcaster Justin Cooper. How's it going, Justin?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, actually. I'm doing very well. I'm so excited to have our guest on today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent, excellent. So, folks, our guest today has been a comic book author since 1990 who has put his indelible stamp on such titles as Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, Superboy, Ion, a 12-part comic book miniseries that follows Kyle Rayner after the 1 year later event, Tales of the Sinestro Corps presents Parallax, and Tales of the Sinestro Corps presents Ion for DC Comics, just to name a few. At Marvel, he's worked on Thor, Secret Defenders, Silver Surfer, Captain America, Namor the Submariner, and What If? Again, just to name a few. He's well known for Batman Aliens, Green Lantern Silver Surfer Unholy Alliances, and the acclaimed DC vs. Marvel crossover. Not only has he conquered the Titans, being Marvel and DC, but he's also worked at CrossGen, Dark Horse, Dynamite Entertainment, Image Comics, Virgin Comics, Devil's Due Publishing's Aftermath line, and Valiant Comics on such titles as Scion, Mystic, Sojourn, The Path, Star Wars Darth Maul, Samurai Heaven and Earth, Blade of Komori, and Exo Man of War, just a small part of his list that is incredibly long. A lifelong fan of the character The Phantom, Ron was the brains behind Moonstone Books' 2006 annual featuring The Phantom, and was responsible for getting writers Chuck Dixon, Mike Bullock, Tony Bedard, and Raphael Neves to participate with chapters for the book. In 2002, he received a Harvey Awards nomination for Best Writer for his work on Scion, which was also nominated for Best Continuing Series. His most recent conquest is as editor of the Dreadstar Omnibus, a 3-volume deluxe hardcover collection of writer-artist Jim Starlin's most famous comic book series, Dreadstar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Mr. Ron Marz.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Awesome, awesome. Glad to have you here. How's the weather where you are? Where are you?
I am in upstate New York, so it's a little nippier than I would like it to be.
Oh, okay. Yeah, same here. I'm in Maine.
Oh, so you know my pain.
Yes.
We finally hit 40 out here in Illinois, so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, last few days here hasn't been bad. It's been, we're on the melting side of things, not the adding inches to the side of things.
Exactly.
So, sort of there's light at the end of the tunnel, I hope.
Yeah, same here. It's looking like 40s for the next week, so I'm hoping for that.
Yeah, right. I was outside today in a t-shirt and it was like 35. I thought it was tropical today.
Yeah.
It's all price conditioning. We're conditioned to be really warm on these days because of all the -2 degrees days that we've had previously. We just can't wait to get out.
Oh yeah, it hasn't been a great winter. Obviously you can't really go anywhere either. So the two of those things together, I've obviously gotten a lot of work done the last few months.
Right. And that actually leads me, I was going to ask you, so you've been able to successfully work from home during the whole pandemic thing?
Yeah, I've been able to successfully work from home for the last 30 years. So this is this is no different from me whatsoever. I've been quarantined, for 3 decades.
That's amazing. That's awesome. So, Ron, tell us about your path to becoming a comic book writer. Were you the type of person you started writing at a young age, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I was the kid in elementary school all the way up to high school that if you needed help on your book report, you came to me. So I could always write. I was always a reader, and it just really never occurred to me to be anything else. So by the time I was in college, I got a part-time job at the local newspaper, and I was a sports reporter and kept that job through college. And by the time I graduated, I just went full-time at the newspaper, became the entertainment editor for the paper. And so that was my first real job. I was like an 18-year-old kid working with adult journalists, actual professionals that really showed me the ropes and taught me how to do that job, and in general taught me how to write succinctly and write on deadline, and the grammar, the punctuation, all of the stuff that you have to know, whether you're writing comics or newspaper articles about high school football games or whatever it was. All of that sort of was in my background, and then I ended up getting led into comics by Jim Starlin, creator of Thanos and Drax and Gamora and the Infinity Gauntlet, that
Yep.
maybe a few people have heard of now because those movies made like a few $1 billion at the box office.
Right.
So I lived in the same area with Jim. We were friends. Kind of moved in the same circles because I got to be friends with Bernie Wrightson, the legendary artist, and then Bernie kind of introduced me to the rest of the social circle, and Jim and I just hit it off, and have been friends ever since. So Jim was the one who kind of led me by the hand into Marvel and said, do you want to try writing comics? And duh, of course. I was a comics fan, and Jim, co-wrote my first few jobs with me after I had copy edited his first prose novel.
Wow.
And that went well enough, and Jim was pleased enough with it that he said, "Hey, do you want to think about writing comics?" And yeah, obviously yes. And I've literally been doing it ever since.
That's amazing.
So that's not the breaking in story that anybody wants to hear, because it can't be replicated.
Right.
It's not who you are, it's who you know. That's nothing.
There's a certain amount of truth to the fact that it to a certain extent it's who you've met. Like, this is a very social business, like most other businesses, and it's who you've met. It's the connections you make. There's networking in this business like any other, maybe even more so than any other. It's a fairly small community of everybody kind of knows everybody else, and you tend to work that network to keep yourself in the business.
Right. And so obviously Jim Starlin sounds like a good guy. How were like Bernie Wrightson and all these guys that you started off with? What kind of people were they?
Just great. I mean, the comics people in general are great. You have to love this to do this, because it's hard, particularly the art end of it. This is the comics artists are to be the special forces of any sort of artist. They, because they have to draw everything. They have to draw everything well, and they have to do it on deadline. They have to produce like a page a day. That's a lot of work. It's a hell of a lot more work than doing in-betweens for animation or animation designs or production design on films or video games. Comic book artists are the guys down in the trenches who can do everything. So, if you're in this business, like nobody's here for the fame and the fortune for the most part. You do this because you love it. So because of that, it ends up attracting people who are good people and who love the medium. So I was very much welcomed kind of into that social circle, and got an amazing education, both creatively and in how the business works, how you get along in comics, how you navigate working at Marvel and DC, and all of the ins and outs that go with it. So I certainly wouldn't be where I am now. I wouldn't be in this business at all without Jim Starlin and Bernie Wrightson.
That's amazing. So do you find, is there a particular artist or maybe several artists that you prefer to work with over others? And you don't have to name names if you don't want to, but I mean, do you have like a pool of artists that you like to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to end up working with, a number of the same people, just because, you click creatively. Bart Sears, Rick Leonardi, Daryl Banks on Green Lantern, Ron Lim on Silver Surfer. Those are all sort of long-term relationships. Those are people that I've known for years, and end up in at least weekly, if not daily, contact with. You tend to go back to the same well when you click with somebody, but one of the joys of doing this is meeting different artists and working with different artists to see how that collaboration goes. I did the Endless Winter crossover at DC in December, which was 9 issues over 5 weeks. And, one of the artists was Phil Hester, who's been a friend of mine for 20 years, and we worked together a few times. So, doing a Superman issue with him was awesome, because we sort of know each other. We know what each other is going to do.
Right.
I worked with the first part of the crossover was drawn by Howard Porter, who's a guy I've known for 25 years, and we had never worked together before. So that was a treat. And then a lot of the other artists were artists that I had never worked with before, and it's a learning process. It's like going on first dates when you work with an artist on a project for the first time. You're trying to figure out what they do best, and you can play to that. And they're trying to figure out, how you write your scripts and how they can plug into that. So, to me, still the best moment of any comic project is when the art starts to fill up your inbox and you're getting the pages back. The stuff that existed just in your head is now made real and concrete on the page, and there's nothing that can replace that.
Do you find that when you're working like with a new artist that you haven't worked with before, that in your script you're putting a lot more visual description in than you would say a Bernie Wrightson, whom you've worked with quite a bit, and they, you have that synergy where he kind of knows what you're thinking and you kind of know what he's thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, like when Bernie and I worked together, he lived a mile and a half down the road from me, so I would just go over to his studio and we'd hang out, we'd do layouts, and so on the one hand, it was like my buddy Bernie, and on the other hand, it's like, oh my God, it's Bernie Wrightson, genius. But he was just like a dude that I went out, we'd go have beers. So
wow,
there's a weird, like, Jim Starlin's still one of my best friends, and it's once in a while I'd step back and go, oh yeah, it's Jim Starlin, not just dude that I've known for 30 years. I mean, I guess you tend to write differently for different artists. You write towards the strengths. You try to, the first conversation is always, well, what do you want to draw and what do you not want to draw? And within reason, you try to play to that. And some artists want, more specific panel description and more details. And others, like Rick Leonardi, for instance, that Rick and I worked on stuff, for years now together. He's drawing a graphic novel that we're doing together for Naval Institute Press right now. Rick, I just need to give sort of here's a description of what happens on the page. Go do what you do.
Nice.
And that's actually a lot of fun. It's almost like, playing in a jazz combo where you're just riffing off of each other, and, I give him some description and he figures out what the page is going to look like, and then it comes back to me for the dialogue, and it's a very improvisational way to work, and it's a lot of fun if you trust your partner, if you trust the artist that you're working with, and they trust you. So it's not the sort of thing you do on a first date,
right?
But as you get used to working with artists, yeah, you know how they're going to approach a page or how they want to approach a page. When Darryl Banks and I did our story in the Green Lantern 80th anniversary special earlier this year, Darryl and I worked on Green Lantern together for 7 years, and it was just like slipping back into a comfy pair of jeans and a hoodie. It's just like he knows what I'm going to do, I know what he's going to do. It's really just you pick right up where you left off. I guess like riding a bicycle is the obvious phrase.
Right.
That's a great book, by the way.
Thanks.
Sorry, Justin, I didn't mean to step on you there. I think, Justin, you and I both have had a chance recently to reread Batman Aliens, which yes. I really loved.
Absolutely.
One thing, Ron, I loved how you captured the character of Batman so perfectly in it, and I feel like a lot of today's Batman writers are still drawing from that.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm obviously, my Batman in that stands on the shoulders of Frank Miller's Batman and Denny O'Neil's Batman, and and everybody, right back to the Golden Age. So, characters like Batman and Superman, you sort of you do your version. You do what you do what feels comfortable to you, and you pull from those sources. So, I did my Batman, somebody else does their Batman. Especially Batman and Superman are elastic enough as characters that you can kind of do your take and somebody else does theirs, and it's different, but it still works because these are, they're sort of fictional icons at this point. They're not just comic book characters. They're probably two of the most famous characters in the world, along with Sherlock Holmes and Tarzan, maybe Three Musketeers, maybe. Like these are characters that everybody knows. Like, I've been all over the world at conventions, and obviously everybody knows Batman and Superman. I was at a convention in Nairobi, Kenya, in 2019.
Wow.
And obviously, you're even though you're on the other side of the world, you're in East Africa, everybody's walking around in a Batman t-shirt.
That's crazy.
That's amazing. Oh my goodness! So how does something like Batman Aliens come about? And were there restrictions because of the property, like specifically with Aliens?
Well, it came about because Bernie and I were in his car coming back from, I think, Manhattan. I think we had been in at one of the old conventions at the Javits Center. This is obviously in the 90s, and we drove back together, and we were just kicking around ideas for stuff that we could maybe work on together. And Bernie suggested, "Hey, what about Batman Aliens?" And I thought, well, that would be awesome, but they'll never let us do it. And he's like, "Yeah, they won't let us do it, but we can ask anyway." And so, like the next week, Bernie called Dark Horse, which had the Aliens license, and talked to Bob Schreck, who was our editor contact out there, just a great editor, and said, "Hey, is there any possibility of doing this?" And Bob said, "Well, geez, I don't know. Let's run it through the proper channels and see." And lo and behold, Dark Horse and DC and 20th Century Fox all said yes.
Wow.
And then we're like, oh shit, we got to come up with a story now. Because we really had nothing more than, Batman versus aliens. Because we didn't, we honestly didn't think that there was going to be any really push to it. We just figured that getting all three of those entertainment companies on the same page was not going to happen.
Right. This predated the Predator story, right?
Yeah, I think it was the first. I think it was the first crossover with the Fox, Aliens, Predator universe, and a comic, comic character from another company. So yeah, then we ended up, Bernie and I ended up going, well, all right, what do you want to draw? And he said, well, I don't want to draw any cars or buildings. Because Bernie was not a straight edge guy. He was not, he didn't want to get out the ruler to rule out buildings in perspective.
That's funny.
Not a lot of cars in Swamp Thing, so
yeah, like Swamp Thing was Swamp Thing was set in a swamp for a reason.
Yeah,
right.
So I said, all right, well, how about the jungle? How about like Mayan ruins and stuff like that? And he said, sure. And then I don't know, like the big gimmick for the book was that that the alien had put a chest burster inside a crocodile,
right,
and produces this huge.
Yeah, I think it's crazy
crocodile alien. It's probably one of the best double page spreads I've ever been in contact with in my career.
Nice.
And so I think that part of that was just when I was a kid, I had a big little book. I actually still have a copy of it. It was a Batman book with like a circus it's like a circus and a zoo in it, and Batman had to like wrestle a lion and a cheetah and stuff like that. And that always made an impression on me. So like anytime I've written Batman, he ends up wrestling some sort of wild animal. So so the crocodile bit came from oh, that'd be cool if Batman had to wrestle a croc. And so the original art to that page where Batman actually wrestles the croc that later gets the chest burster put into it, that page is hanging on my office wall.
Wow.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. So you've done other crossovers titles like, Batman, Tarzan, Claws of the Catwoman, Darkness, Superman, Green Lantern, Silver Surfer. What is it about crossovers that you enjoy doing?
More than anything, it's just the fact that you're telling a story that nobody's told before. When you're putting together characters who have not met before, you're getting to do something completely new. So there's no, you don't have to worry about what precedent was set or what continuity is or anything like that. You can just tell a new story. So, I ended up doing so many of them because I liked it. I would propose them or they would come to me. And I guess I had hopefully still do, had a reputation for, for being able to play well with others. Like, you have to make everybody happy, everybody in the room happy. That's what, Marvel versus DC was that process writ large because we had to make all of the editors across both companies happy with the way we were using their characters. And so, having a reputation as somebody that's easy to work with and is not going to be a difficulty in terms of pulling all of these various characters together. Probably helped me out quite a bit. But it's just fun. We did Batman Tarzan. We didn't think we were going to get that approved. We did.
Wow.
And then I think Green Lantern Aliens came after Batman Tarzan, and that was one where it just seemed an obvious one to do. Probably even more obvious than Batman Aliens, at least from a story standpoint, not from a maybe as much commercial standpoint.
Right.
And that was one where I proposed it, and I think it was Dark Horse's turn. Usually, like the editorial aspects of those books would go for the crossovers that they would do. DC would run one, and then Dark Horse would run one, and DC would run one, and Dark Horse would run one. Even though they're obviously both approving everything along the way, but the bulk of the editorial work was done by one or the other, and I seem to end up on stuff that generally got handled at Dark Horse. So for Green Lantern Aliens, that was one where I proposed it, and then I never heard anything. I think I actually proposed it at DC, and DC, it turned out that it was Dark Horse's turn to do the next one. So, like a month goes by, and I hadn't heard anything, and I just figured it was dead. We weren't going to do it. And then an editor from Dark Horse called me up and said, "Hey, when am I going to get this script?" And I was like, "Well, what script are you talking about?" And he's like, Green Lantern Aliens, we got to get going. This thing is on the schedule. And I'm like, maybe somebody should have told me. So, it was one of those things where DC thought Dark Horse had told me, and Dark Horse thought DC had told me. And, suddenly we had a book that needed to get done in the relative near future. So we had to just go. And thankfully, I think that was the first time I worked with Rick Leonardi. So thankfully Rick's schedule was clear, and we ended up with just a terrific team on that book.
Yeah, the art's great.
Rick Leonardi penciling and Mike Perkins inking and Dave Stewart coloring. It's really one of my favorite jobs ever.
Nice.
It's a deeper book too, because it goes into the morality of exterminating an alien sentient life form, and then it has like this sort of undertone of still Kyle being in Hal's shadow, even though Hal is terrible. I'll just put that out there. But Kyle is great. So, and he just doesn't get out of that shadow. And everyone's like, well, Hal did it this way. It's like, well, Hal's not here. I'm all you got. And I really appreciate that aspect of Kyle, because he never tried to be anything other than himself. And he's just such a great character.
Thanks. I appreciate that. The opportunity to do that book allowed us to obviously compare and contrast the two. Gave me an opportunity to sort of write Hal in his prime, which I always enjoyed.
Yeah.
And get Green Arrow and Black Canary in there as well.
Oh, so awesome.
Nice. And Rick just did masterful work on those pages. And then so it was the high school book report deal. It was the compare and contrast. How did Hal handle this and how did Kyle handle this? And ultimately, like a spoiler on a 20-year-old comic, Kyle decides to like wipe out the aliens because what else are you going to do? And that's not how the end was envisioned.
Huh.
When I initially pitched it, he ended up making the same choice as Hal, which was you can't just end this life because they're basically like sharks. They just do what they do. And the end didn't work. So, and I, for that 4th issue script, I ended up wrestling with the ending quite a bit because it just, every time I wrote it, it didn't ring true. Like everything that they had been through in the series led you dramatically to the conclusion that where we were headed. But finally, I called the editor at Dark Horse, Dave Landon. I was like, dude, I think I got to kill them all. And he was like, okay, that sounds fine.
Oh no, there'll never be any more aliens. Yeah.
It's like if that's what works, go ahead and do it, and I'll get it approved. And that's exactly what happened. It was one of those things where usually when you do a story, when you do a script, you kind of know where you're starting and generally where you're going to end, and then the journey in the middle is the part where you figure out how to get from one to the other. And this one, the ending was figured out, and it just wasn't the ending we ended up doing because it wasn't the right one.
Huh. On DC versus Marvel, I mean, obviously you said you were able to work well with. I mean, you had two companies to work with to deal with all these characters. That was challenging enough, probably. But how much more difficult did they make things when they made it the outcome put to a vote to the readers?
It wasn't really that much more difficult. And honestly, all of the editors involved were great because they were very much directed from the top down to say, look, this is a big, popcorn tentpole sort of story. Like, don't get caught up in the details. Like, this is supposed to be a broad, entertaining story for everybody.
Oh, okay.
So all of the editors were really well behaved, as supervised by Mark Grunwald at Marvel and Mike Carlin at DC. So in that sense, like everything that we did pretty much went through as is. There was no real pushback on any of it. And certainly, look, Peter David and I writing alternating issues, we were both working at Marvel and DC regularly anyway. That's one of the reasons that we ended up with the gig, is that we were working at both companies. We knew both companies. Both companies were comfortable with us. So that's one of the benefits of sort of, tilling soil in both of those fields at the same time.
Nice. Yeah, I remember that. I was very excited to see that Marvel and DC were going to, combine together finally. It was one of those things we had waited for a long time.
Oh, this is, I've told the story before, but it's the honest to God truth. I remember being like 10 years old and writing a letter to Marvel and a letter to DC. And those remain my only letters of comment to Marvel and DC. As like a 10-year-old kid, suggesting to both companies that the Avengers and the Justice League should meet. Because obviously no one had ever thought of this. I mean, my 10-year-old wisdom, I figured I need to tell them about this because this is a really good idea, and obviously they're not doing it. So, I should alert them to what they're missing out on.
But that sort of passion is what comes through in something like this. When you get to play in that sandbox, you're like, well, wouldn't it be cool if, Spider-Man had to fight the Joker and Batman had to fight, wouldn't that be neat if they got to kind of like cross-pollinate? I think that's like that spark.
Yeah, that's ultimately what the whole thing was. It was, wouldn't it be cool if, and then the if was everything that we did. And it was it was the big battles and the little battles and the team ups that we showed for just one panel.
Yeah.
We tried to
poor Namor.
Yeah, right. So we tried to have to cover as many bases as possible, even though, obviously, we had, I don't know what it was, 140 pages or 150 pages or whatever it was total. We could have had 10 times that many pages and still not have done everything that we would have wanted to do. But, we did what we could in the space that we had. And, just the way it was structured, we knew, okay, these battles have to end up, the sort of the preliminary battles have to wind up 3-3 in terms of who wins. And then, then the 5 big battles all landed in my lap in issue 3. So I had to get all of those out of the way. And I had to write 2 different endings for each of those 5 battles.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Because, ultimately we knew that, look, Batman's going to beat Captain America. And Superman's going to beat the Hulk. And, it was, basically popularity contest for everybody. And because it was, because it was up for a vote, the only one that we weren't really sure on was Storm Wonder Woman, because that was sort of a toss up. It was the, Wonder Woman's an icon, but Storm's in the X-Men. The X-Men was the biggest book in the world at that point. So we just didn't know how that one was going to go. And I think the votes were fairly close on that.
Wow.
So that's, so I ended up writing 2 different endings for every battle, basically. And we ended up having those 2 different endings drawn.
There's still talk on this today about the Wolverine and the Loki, or the Lobo. Just how it ended up behind the bar and all that, and then just Wolverine comes up afterwards. Still to this day, there's people talking about, I don't know what happened, I don't know what's going on, and,
Yeah, I actually said this on Twitter a couple weeks ago or last week, that I will be on my deathbed, and somebody will come into the room and go, hey, Wolverine didn't really beat Lobo, right?
You're like, it wasn't me. It was the same people that killed Jason Todd.
Yeah. So yeah, honest to God, people still bring that up, on social media, in person at shows, back in the halcyon days when there were shows.
It's hilarious.
So yeah, it's just like, look, I get it. But talk to the people that voted. And honestly, they went behind the bar because we or at least I wanted to pay off those battles with as little redrawing as possible. So the idea that we could replace, like, at most a page, but even if we could get away with it, half a page of art to swap in once we got the vote totals.
Right.
That's why Superman pounds the Hulk into a mountain, or Superman and the Hulk end up crashing into a mountain, and the mountain comes down on top of them, and then Superman rises from the rubble. Well, there's a version of that page with the Hulk rising from the rubble, and it's just so it's not a completely redrawn page. It's just some of the page that got redrawn, and the same thing for Wolverine Lobo. That was actually the one that we did the least redrawing for, because I was like, let's have them go behind the bar, and they're both sort of drinkers and carousers. Yeah. They both smoke cigars. So
yeah.
Let's pay that off. Of course, this was 25 years ago, and you could actually have characters in your comic smoking cigars.
Right. So now this led into the Amalgam series of books that they did. Did you have to have some foresight, moving into that, or was that someone else that sort of took the baton and carried it forward?
Well, that was the first meeting that we had for Marvel versus DC, that actually took place at Mark Grunwald's apartment in Manhattan, because they didn't want us meeting on site at either publisher, because they were afraid that people were going to start putting two and two together. Like,
oh, smart.
The editorial staffs at the companies didn't know this was going on. They told nobody. So we actually met at Mark's apartment and talked about all this stuff, and then went and had lunch at a Mexican restaurant around the corner and continued to plot it out. But at that initial meeting is when, obviously doing Marvel versus DC, okay, they're going to fight. Like, that's, it's comics. They're going to fight each other. Duh. So when Mike and Mark actually said, this is what's going to happen in between the third and fourth issues, and told us about the Amalgam Universe, I mean, I was slack-jawed. I was just like, you're kidding. Like, we're actually going to do this? To me, it was just a delightful concept to mash the characters together. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody ever, the expected thing is, there's going to be a big fight. Not that everything's going to get smushed together and we're going to do amalgamated versions of the two universes. It was just so much fun. And then Mike and Mark had the list prepared already of what 12 books were going to be in the Amalgam release. So, Dark Claw and Super Soldier and all that stuff was already sort of figured out. And when they got to Strange Fate on the list, I said, "Oh, I'm doing that one, or I'm walking out of the room right now."
Nice.
And obviously, that was a lie, because I wasn't walking out of the room, and passing on the opportunity. But I was like, "Oh, I got to do that one," and they were like, "Okay, fine, you can do that one."
That's awesome.
And so that was, obviously still one of my favorite projects ever. Is that single issue of Doctor Strange Fate, and also one of the only times I've ever had stage fright writing a comic, like the whole Marvel versus DC, Batman fighting Captain America, Superman fighting the Hulk, like none of that. Like, I just sat down and did that. That was easy peasy. Writing Doctor Strange Fate, because I knew that Jose Luis Garcia Lopez was going to draw it, who to me is one of the the comics geniuses of the medium ever.
Oh yeah.
And then Kevin Nolan inking it, because Kevin's a pretty good friend. So I wasn't really intimidated by Kevin, but I was sure as hell intimidated by Garcia Lopez. And I sat around for like 2 weeks trying to make sure that, I had to write a script that was worthy of Garcia Lopez. I can't come with my B game. I gotta bring my A game for Garcia Lopez. And I just put all of this pressure on myself, and I didn't get anything done for like 2 weeks. And the editor, whose idea it was to put Jose on it in the first place. I went into the office, for a meeting after the offices knew what we were doing, and Dan Thorslin was the editor, and I went into his office and to talk about that, because they basically told him, look, Ron's going to write this one. So I went into Dan's office and I said, look, I don't really care who you get to pencil it, but Kevin Nolan's got to ink it, because he's he's like the best Doctor Strange artist ever. And he's like, that's cool. How about Garcia Lopez to pencil it? And I was like, holy shit, really? So yeah, I mean, like within an hour, he had called both Kevin and Jose, and it was done. And then I had to go home and write it, and I was stalled for 2, maybe even 3 weeks to do the thing. And then lo and behold, I finally realized that, like, I could write the worst script in the world. Like, I could write the Westchester phone book, and and they would hand it to Garcia Lopez, and it would look awesome. It would be brilliant. Like, so I was really incidental to the process. So once I came to that conclusion of like, oh, I don't really need to worry about it, because I'm just going to ride the coattails of 2 genius artists, I sat down and wrote the script in like 2 days.
Nice.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. So when you were at DC, when you started, was Julie Schwartz still there, or Jeanette Kahn? Were they still there?
Jeanette was still there. Julie was gone, because I started at Marvel. I mean, literally my first gig in comics was at Marvel. And I was there for the first few years of my career, and then sort of migrated over to DC, doing some Green Lantern quarterly stories, and then obviously being offered the Green Lantern monthly. So Jeanette was still there, but I think she left not too long after I started working at DC. I'm not sure of the timing exactly, but for most of my tenure at DC, Paul Levitz was the guy, and Paul was when DC called me to offer me Green Lantern, Paul was in the room, so he was certainly the guiding hand.
And at Marvel, did you work with you worked with Jim Shooter, obviously, right, when you started there?
No, Shooter was gone. I started at Marvel in 1990, and Shooter was gone shortly before that. To everyone's sigh of relief, I think, because Jim was kind of an editorial hard ass.
Yeah.
And the editors ran in fear from him. But so I kind of slid in after Jim was gone.
He had probably started Valiant at that point.
Yeah, he was over at Valiant. Tom DeFalco was the editor-in-chief when I started at Marvel.
Oh, okay. And did you end up working with Jim when you did the titles over at Valiant?
No, again, Jim left Valiant by the time I got over there. He must have thought I was stalking him for a while. So Jim had left Valiant, and when I got to Valiant, they had just been bought out by, I don't even remember who.
Acclaim.
Acclaim had bought them out. So there was money to do a lot of stuff. There was money to, we basically relaunched the whole line at Valiant, and I had a ball doing it. We actually hired our own editor over from Marvel to work at Valiant. Lanier Brust was my Silver Surfer assistant editor, and Valiant needed somebody to edit Exo for Bart Sears and Andy Smith and I. And we were like, well, go hire Lanier from Marvel. And they did, although it took a while for her to get into place. So I think the first two or three issues of Exo, we didn't have an editor. We just did it.
That's interesting. And you've got a lot of creator-owned books, including, Dragon Prince for Top Cow and, Samurai Heaven and Earth for Dark Horse. Do you prefer creator-owned work since you have control over everything, or is it just as fun to play in the other company's sandboxes like Marvel and DC?
They're both fun, but they're just different kinds of fun. I mean, I like pizza and I like steak. I don't want to eat just one.
Right.
But, creator, I always feel like the thing that I always liken it to is work for hire is a job, and it's a great job. Playing with Batman and Superman and Silver Surfer and, whatever work for hire stuff you do, Star Wars. I've written Star Wars and Conan and Skylanders for IDW. Like all of that stuff is great, and it's a really good job. But it's a job. It's not a career per se, because there's always somebody that's going to come along and do that job after you.
Right.
Nobody's ever the permanent writer on Batman. You play with the toys for a while, and then somebody else comes in and plays with the toys. So I think it's always a good idea to balance work for hire stuff, which is you get paid, you make royalties, and it's just absolutely delightful to be able to play with all those toys. But you balance that against creator-owned stuff, which you own. I mean, ultimately, you own that material, and nobody, on your creator-owned stuff, nobody's going to come in and write it after you. It's yours, and you reap the benefits of that. Robert Kirkman is Robert Kirkman not because he wrote Ultimate X-Men for a year and a half. He's...
Hey, someone else remembered that. All right.
I mean, he is who he is, and was able to, obviously be vastly successful and start his own imprint and all of that stuff because of his creator-owned work, because of Walking Dead and Invincible and everything else. So, I always think it's easier for writers to do both of those things, because writers are obviously always working on multiple projects, or at least those of us who are fortunate enough to be working on multiple projects. So you can do the creator-owned stuff next to the work for hire stuff, and you can sort of play on both of those courts. It's a little tougher for artists because you can kind of only do one job at a time as an artist. It's labor intensive enough that you can't really, you're not going to be drawing 2 monthly books at a time. There's, the guys that can actually do that, you can count on one hand minus a few fingers. It's very rare for somebody to be able to produce more pages than that per month. So that's one of the real benefits of being a writer, is that you can do the work for hire stuff while you're working on your creator-owned stuff, and you fill your library. And by library I mean the stuff that's yours, the creator-owned stuff. When you've got 5 or 10 or 20 properties, those are yours forever, and you build your library as you go.
So when you're working on something like a Star Wars title, like the Darth Maul titles, do you find that as opposed to, say, working for a Marvel or a DC where, the characters are always in-house, and this is something that's more, say, licensed to the company, are there restrictions, or like a laundry list of restrictions, or characters and situations that you can or cannot use?
Not really. I mean, it ultimately depends on who the licensor is. When I was doing Star Wars, Lucasfilm got comics. They understood comics. They knew how they worked. And generally, once I had their confidence that I knew what I was doing, they kind of left me alone. They trusted me to do the job. You will get other licensors that you work for, and they don't really understand how comics work as well as you would hope they would. So there's always kind of fingers in your pie. There's always somebody looking over your shoulder. So Star Wars, for instance, I found no different than really writing for Marvel or DC. In some ways, it was actually easier than writing for Marvel or DC, because Marvel and DC's continuity don't make sense. Like Batman's still 35 and he showed up in 1939.
Right.
So,
I'm not going to argue. I'm a fan of convergence. So
yeah, none of the stuff makes any sense, right? In terms of being one long epic story, but the Star Wars stuff actually does. Because there was a timeline, and when I was working on Star Wars Empire, I was working in the period between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, so I knew exactly where my beginning point was and where my ending point was in terms of where I could tell stories. So in some ways, Star Wars was easier because it made sense. But in the long run, they're really not that different. Because frankly, everybody goes, oh, like Star Wars or Star Trek, those are licensed properties. They must be much tougher, right? And I'm like, what do you think Batman and Superman and X-Men are? They're licensed properties too. They just, you just happen to be working for the people that own the license. So to me, it was really no different, other than whoever was the approvals person on the owner's end of things. If they didn't really if you weren't on the same page with them, it could be difficult. And I've had some of those instances where you just didn't get onto the same page with the people that were charged with approvals. And if they didn't understand how comics worked, there was always grief. There was always, they would get to the end of a book, like the book would be finished, and they go, "Oh, we want to change some things. Like, can you fix this? And can you fix this in post?" And we're like, "Yeah, that's not really how it works here.
Right.
There's no post here. Once it's drawn, it's drawn."
Oh, man.
Greetings, this is Mr. Lobo. Are you a sinsomniac? Do you stay up late and watch what normal people call bad movies till dawn? Black and white low-budget pot boilers, box office bombs, West German talking car movies, rock bands versus monster movies, broken down school films, midget zombie and midget spy flicks, guys in gorilla suit movies, even old TV commercials, inappropriate cartoons, drive-in snack bar ads, and worse? Well, we like to say they're not bad movies, just misunderstood. Stay up late with Miss Mittens, your host, Mr. Lobo, and a revolving door of special guests, fellow horror movie hosts, robot monsters, and lovely Real 7 girls for a late-night TV slumber party that we call Cinema Insomnia. You can watch us on channel OSI 74 for Roku. We even have some episodes on Amazon and Alpha Video DVD. You may never get a good night's sleep again.
Prepare for a spine-tingling, nerve-shattering podcast featuring all your favorite monsters. You won't believe your ears when you listen to Monster Kid Radio. Here are your hosts, Derek M. Cook, and his ever-rotating stable of guests discuss your favorite classic and sometimes not-so-classic monster movies. Subscribe to Monster Kid Radio through iTunes or Stitcher, or visit monsterkidradio.net before the next weekly episode of Monster Kid Radio. Go through the archives for interviews with Sarah Karloff, Victoria Bryce, and Joel Hodgson. Listen to discussions about movies like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Island of Terror, and King Kong. And don't forget convention coverage from Monster Bash and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival. Classic monsters, modern talk, and the head of Rondo Hatton. Only on Monster Kid Radio.
Hello, this is Rod Barnett. I'm the host of The Bloody Pit, the podcast that examines films from across the decades. On The Bloody Pit, we have several ongoing series of shows within the show focused on specific things in genre cinema that I and my co-hosts find fascinating. There's a long-running series focused on Italian maestro Antonio Margheriti's films from the 1960s all the way up through 1990. There's an on-again, off-again series focused on 1970s science fiction films. There's an in-depth look at the Western movies that William Castle made before he struck out on his own and became the horror auteur that we know and love. A look at the classic Coffin Joe films from Brazil. And our long-term project to look at every Universal horror film made in the 1940s. That's a long project, people. It's going to take us a long time. Sprinkled in amongst those are various other episodes focused on other stranger areas of cinema, like Lucio Fulci, Dario Argento, and even some obscure British crime films from time to time. So join me and my rotating crew of co-hosts as we examine the stranger side of cinema through an exploitation lens. Except when we don't. Yeah, you never really know exactly what to expect on The Bloody Pit. So join me for The Bloody Pit.
I do have a couple of questions for you that are not comic related. So let's step away from comics for just a brief moment. I got a couple of deep dive questions that I'm curious about. Can you tell us anything about this Star Wars Vader extinction that you wrote for a Spanish company in 2008? Was it a movie or what was it?
It's actually, I guess it's an adaptation of a Star Wars Tales two-parter that I did that ended up in Star Wars Tales 1 and 2, drawn by Claudio Castellini. So it looks amazing. So it's basically an adaptation of the comic that I wrote that I didn't have any idea existed until somebody told me it was like on my IMDb.
Right.
And I've honestly never seen it. I have no idea what it is. But as far as I know, it's an adaptation of the comic, which is actually not even an in continuity comic in that sense, because Star Wars Tales was was sort of non-canon stories. Although every time I did a story for Star Wars Tales, I wrote it basically so that it was in canon anyway. If you wanted to make it into your head canon, they would fit properly.
Oh, that's cool. And what can you tell us about the Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 game that you wrote?
Yeah, I wrote it.
Thank you for that game.
It was, I think it was my first video game gig, and it was actually produced by a company called Vicarious Visions, which is based here in Albany, New York, and is still based in Albany, New York. So I got a call from an ex-Marvel editor named Evan Skolnick, who I think I had done like a short story or two or something like that for Evan when he was on staff up at Marvel. And this was post CrossGen, so we had just moved back to New York State from the godless wastelands of Florida, which would actually be really good right now since it's 25 degrees out.
Right.
So I had run into an artist named John Hebert, like in Starbucks or something. Just a guy who I had known back in the 90s, who had gotten out of comics and was working for the state or something like that. I just bumped into him, and he's like, "Oh, are you back?" And I said, "Yeah, back doing comics." And he knew Evan that was working at Vicarious Visions, and Evan called me and said, "Hey, do you want to write some video game dialogue? Do you want to help us do this Marvel Ultimate Alliance game?" So I ended up going into their office and meeting with them, and and obviously I knew more about comics than anybody in the building except Evan, because I had been working on them.
Right.
So I did a bunch of dialogue for Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and it was actually a lot of fun. And a lot of it was just like coming up with 4 or 5 or 6 different ways to have a character deliver a specific line. Like Dr. Doom, celebrates his victory, and you come up with 6 different ways for him to say that, so that the game doesn't repeat the same line every time. There's like branching dialogue. So that was really my first video game stuff. And then for Vicarious, I ended up working on Ultimate Alliance 2, the Spider-Man 2 video game. So I ended up writing dialogue that I guess got read by Toby, and
wow.
I forget who played Venom in that movie.
Oh, it was Topher Grace.
Yeah, right, Topher Grace. So yeah, I wrote a bunch of dialogue that ended up getting delivered, and some of it ended up getting cut by those guys. And then so I'm still, Vicarious Visions is still here in a beautiful new office that they can't go to because of COVID. I was brought in on more projects by a friend named Dave Rodriguez, who I had actually, this is sort of an illustration of how everybody ends up knowing everybody. Is when I was at CrossGen, we did what were called motion comics, but it was basically like pan and scan comics from the artwork. And that was produced by a company called High Voltage just outside of Chicago. And High Voltage, being a video game company, but also did production and sound design and all that stuff on these. They were essentially DVDs that CrossGen produced, which I think I still have a complete set of downstairs. There's some of them are online too. If you look up some of the like Sojourn and Scion and some of the other CrossGen titles, they're
right
on YouTube now. You can actually watch them.
Oh, that's cool.
So one of the people at High Voltage ended up being this guy Dave Rodriguez, who I had met at the Chicago convention a few years before that, when he came and had his Scion issues signed. So I ended up being friends with Dave. And then, lo and behold, Dave ended up moving to Albany to work for Vicarious Visions. And I just, like, stumbled into him one day. And I'm like, don't you live in Chicago? What are you doing here? I live here now. So, so Dave is now the narrative director at Vicarious Visions, and they've brought me in to work on, a number of different Skylanders games and some other stuff that they're part of Activision now, Activision Blizzard. So I've worked on a bunch of different stuff for them over the years, and hopefully we'll do so again. It's just, it's a really fun gig, and Vicarious just, treats everybody tremendously well. They're a lot of fun to work for.
Skylanders was such a good idea. Just like taking the physical aspect of it and making it there for kids. My nephews were obsessed with this stuff.
Well, in a lot of ways, CrossGen was sort of ahead of its time in terms of trying to take the material that we were producing and put it on as many different platforms as possible. Single issues, collected editions, small size digest editions, digital. I think they were one of the first places to do comics online. And then did this sort of motion comics thing. They did school tutorials with a bunch of their books. So that in a lot of ways, the stuff that CrossGen was doing then is widespread now. We just ran out of money before they could really make their mark.
No, I read that CrossGen was bought by Disney and then slid over to Marvel. Is there still anything in the works with them?
Yeah, I mean, CrossGen was bought by Disney for, I believe, a cool $1 million. Wow. When everything was going into the bankruptcy. Marvel bought CrossGen because they wanted to get their hands on a J.M. DeMatteis, Mike Klug project called Abadazad, which is a terrific little book. I don't know if it's ever been reprinted as a collection or not, but it was just gorgeous. It was this sort of Oz-like fantasy world, and this lush artwork by Mike Klug, and that's what Disney wanted. Essentially, Disney was willing to pay $1 million for that, and everything else was kind of a toss-in. So they bought the whole kit and caboodle, and ultimately, I don't think they really knew what they had. They were just interested in a couple of different things, and all the rest of them just kind of sat there. So when Disney bought Marvel, somebody at Disney remembered, oh, didn't we buy another comic company at some point? Give that stuff to Marvel. So Marvel did some reboots of a few different pieces of it that never really took off. They were different enough from the original CrossGen concepts that Marvel wasn't appealing to the old fans, and the new fans who weren't familiar with CrossGen didn't care about the stuff anyway. So it was, it was neither fish nor fowl, so nobody really paid attention to it. And now it just kind of sits. I mean, at one point, I had a discussion with Marvel about bringing back sort of the CrossGen universe in a big crossover as part of one of Marvel's events. We're going to do a separate miniseries, and actually got fairly far down the road on it before the editor that I was working with ended up getting transferred out to LA rather than on staff at Marvel, and without a patron to push it, the whole thing just kind of died.
Right. So, what can you tell us about Witchblade? Because it seems like that's really close to, near and dear to your heart, because you keep going back to it. What's the appeal for you for Witchblade?
I just, I ended up just liking the character and the concept a bunch because they were very elastic. I could do any kind of story I wanted to with Witchblade, really. I could do supernatural, horror, crime procedural. I could sort of brush up against superhero stuff with some of the other Top Cow characters. So I could tell a whole range of stories. And I really liked the main character. I like Sarah Pazzini a lot. She was a very real person to me, or at least I tried to make her into a very real person. And it was, I had never read an issue of Witchblade in my life when they offered me the book. And Top Cow very much let me do what I do. They were very supportive of just take the book and run with it. And it turned out to be just a great fit. So I ended up writing it for the better part of 10 years.
Wow. That's amazing. Did you have any hand in the TV show that they had done?
No, I had other than watching the premiere, no hand at all. the show was over with by the time I took over the book. The show was long gone, and it's funny. I was supposed to do a convention appearance with Yancey Butler, who played Sarah Pazzini in the TV show somewhere. I forget, maybe New Hampshire, or it was not terribly far afield. And then she ended up having to cancel, and the show called me up and was like, if you want to come, you can still come, but without her here, maybe there's not as much interest in Witchblade, so we'll save it for another time. And I think we just scrapped it. But yeah, at some point, maybe I'll get to actually do a convention panel with her or something like that, because she was actually an actress that I liked anyway. From I believe she was on NYPD Blue.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's true. So now, obviously, I know that you're a huge fan of the Phantom, because you wrote some of that stuff for Moonstone. I read that you were supposed to write some prose novels for them too about the Phantom. Did that ever come about?
No, I ended up never doing it. So the Phantom is an itch that I've always wanted to scratch. I like all of that pulp stuff very much. So the Phantom, Tarzan, John Carter, the Shadow, Doc Savage, like all of that stuff was on my bucket list to do. Like I got to do at least once, and I think I've been able to check that off. Everybody except Doc Savage. So the company called Moonstone had the Phantom license, and I knew a guy named Mike Bullock who was doing some stuff for him, and we just ended up talking. I'm like, well, look, I know Moonstone doesn't have a lot of money, and they don't pay great rates, but I'm willing to do a Phantom annual or something like that, just to get my hands on the character for once.
Nice.
So we ended up working it out so that, and I lured in a bunch of buddies like Mike and Chuck Dixon and Raphael and Tony Bedard. So we split up like a 48-page story so that everybody did a chunk of the story, and it took place in different eras. So that frankly nobody was working for like really low rates for 48 pages. We're all working for really low rates for like 8 or 10 pages.
Oh, cool.
So I still got to scratch my Phantom itch and work with a buddy named Ruben Procopio, who's also a big Phantom fan. Ruben is an ex-Disney animator. So we got to, that was our chance to work together on the opening chapter of the story. And I really remember that gig fondly. It just turned out great.
That's amazing. One other obscure question for you here. You wrote Beyond for Virgin Comics, which was supposed to be 4 issues. I guess it was created by Deepak Chopra, but they only published 3 of them. What's the story there?
It was an adaptation of a screenplay that Deepak Chopra wrote.
Oh, okay.
And Deepak's son Gotham, who is now doing sports films and just a really good dude. Gotham's the one who brought me into the company I did a fair amount of editing for them as well as writing stuff for them. So that's how that connection happened. He was a fan of my CrossGen stuff, and we were introduced by like a mutual friend, and we got on well, and they brought me in. So they had this screenplay that his dad had written, and they wanted me to adapt it to a comic. So I did, and I believe the fourth issue was done, and I think you can get it on Comixology. I believe that the whole thing eventually got completed.
Oh, good.
So it was Virgin Comics at the time, and then after a certain amount of time, when you had to show a profit in order to keep using the Virgin name because they were funded by Richard Branson. And they got to the end of that period, and Branson decided not to re-up the deal. So I think that's why the last one never came out. But like the people that ran Virgin were very good to me, and still are. They're now Liquid Comics, and they still do a lot of stuff in India. And I've done a number of books with them in the time since. And eventually, that last issue of Beyond got done. And it's really a nice little package. I actually wish we would be able to like print that in a trade paperback or something, because the story was cool. It was very sort of metaphysical, and it was very real world, but also metaphysical at the same time. And the art by an artist named Edison George was just terrific.
That's awesome. So let's move on to the Dreadstar Omnibus. How did that come about?
Well, Jim Starlin and I hang out, and eventually, we got talking about, well, do you want to put Dreadstar out again in a couple of big fat hardcovers? And he said, yeah, and so we ended up doing that at Ominous Press, and Jim ended up doing like all of the refurbishment, all of the remastering of it. Went in and we fixed typos. He recolored a lot of stuff. He took out some recap pages that when you put the whole thing together in a 500-page hardcover, some of it's redundant because you don't need the recap pages because it's not a monthly product anymore.
Right.
So we ended up publishing like 1,500 pages. It's all the Dreadstar stuff that Jim wrote and drew, and then the stuff that Jim wrote that other artists worked on as well. So it's about 1,500 pages in three hardcover volumes, and there's a slipcase version too that's just really gorgeous. The covers are new by Jim. The slipcase has new Jim art on it, and for a while that looked like the last art that Jim was going to do because he had an accident with a SodaStream machine, a cartridge, CO2 cartridge ended up blowing up on him and taking a chunk out of his drawing hand.
Oh wow!
Ooh. Oh my God!
And so it looked for a while. Well, for one, it looked like Jim was really lucky to be alive because it just it was an accident. There was basically shrapnel everywhere.
Oh my God!
And took a chunk out of his drawing hand, and Jim really felt like he was not going to be able to draw anymore. That was just going to be the end of it. He was just going to be a writer. But little by little, he got and this took a couple of years for him to sort of get back into drawing shape. And the more he did it, the more he did it, the more he did it. He could he said he would initially he could pencil for like 10 or 15 minutes. And the muscles in his hand would cramp up so bad that he had to stop for the day. And then, 10 minutes became 30 minutes, and 30 minutes became an hour. And little by little, he built himself back up so that now he's just completed a brand new Dreadstar graphic novel that we published. It's 100 pages called, obviously, Dreadstar Returns. And I can neither confirm nor deny that Jim is drawing the second volume of that series, right?
Wow.
So it's Jim Starlin is back writing and drawing, and we hope to be able to finish telling the rest of the Dreadstar saga.
That's amazing. The book itself is really impressive, and it's just beautiful to look at it. Justin, you have it too, right?
Yeah, I actually picked up the digital copy of it.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a bit of a scab here. I'm sorry. I have a lot of Dreadstar issues from different comic companies, but I never had anything that was completely collected like that. So I picked it up on Comixology.
Well, it was a real chore, labor of love, obviously, but it was a real chore to gather everything because some of it was painted artwork that appeared in Epic Illustrated, so that's a slightly different size ratio than a normal comic page. So we had to finesse a lot of stuff to make sure that it all fit in the book and nothing was squashed, and it was an appropriate presentation of this material. And a lot of it was like some of it we just the files didn't exist anymore for most of it. So Jim ended up having to buy his own issues on eBay so that he could get the original issues back and scan them. And then our production guy, Phil Smith, would take the scans and manipulate them so you don't get a lot of the, moire patterns and all the stuff that you usually see when somebody scans a book and prints it. So we went the extra mile to try to avoid that look. And there are a bunch of different filters and methods you can use to make it look just like the original rather than, a copy of a copy.
Right. That's amazing. How long did it take you to pull it all together?
I took probably a year at least to get everything together. And then, and the vast majority of it was Jim working with Phil Smith to make sure that everything was how he wanted. So, and then we filled the back of the book with extras and like I said, it was a real labor of love. Phil Smith happens to be a really big Starlin and Dreadstar fan anyway, so he was tickled to death working on it. So it was ultimately a very satisfying project, but very meticulous, page by page for 1,500 pages, making sure everything's right, and then proofreading it, color correcting it, and it was a long and laborious process, but it's been very successful. We've had to go back to print with it, so it was nice that it found a really receptive audience.
That's awesome. Yeah, Dreadstar is one of those comics that I always crossed paths with when I was younger, but it just for whatever reason, it never fell into my wheelhouse. And now that I've read it, I feel like I'm glad I read it, as an adult, as opposed to when I was like in my teens or 20s, because I wouldn't have gotten it.
It was actually a book that I read when I was a teenager, before I'd ever met Jim, and it was a favorite of mine because it was the kind of material that you graduated to after superheroes.
Yeah.
And so it was a little bit more adult, but it was still that cool Starlin art, and there's, robots and magic swords and, space battles and all that stuff.
Yeah, there were a lot of themes in it though too. I think would have gone over my head if I had read it when I was younger.
It's definitely pure Starlin. And the new material is too. The new material we did we did the Dreadstar Returns hardcover, as well as a Dreadstar guidebook, which was basically not design wise, but the same sort of book as the Handbook to the Marvel Universe and the DC Who's Who, where it's all of the information about all of the characters that you could want.
I will probably have to find that. That sounds great.
We just did a final press check today, in fact, to get all of it's written by Bob Greenberger, who is the guy, ex-DC editor, who wrote the vast majority of the DC Who's Who, and Bob is sort of like the guru of the guys who do that stuff. So Bob's also written a bunch of Star Trek novels, and
that's why I know his name.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Bob's just a great guy, great editor to work for. And, when we decided that we should do a Dreadstar guidebook, there was only one name on my list. And so I called Bob, and he was into it, did a tremendous job, just like researching the whole thing and getting all of those original Starlin characters in there. And then Phil Smith did the design and production on it, and sort of carried through the same design that we did for the omnibus volumes. The same basic design ethos carries through all of the material, so it's all very cohesive.
Nice. Do you have any plans of, or you and Jim, I should say, have any plans of maybe turning Dreadstar into some kind of a streaming series or a movie of some kind?
Jim's always got, there's always Hollywood interest in Dreadstar, and obviously the success of Thanos and Drax and Gamora has put even more of a Hollywood spotlight on Jim. So I would think that Dreadstar is certainly in play for that kind of adaptation. But as with all things in the film and TV world, until it happens, until the cameras start rolling, it's never written in stone.
Right.
What about merchandising for Dreadstar? Any plans for statues or action figures, things like that?
We did T-shirts and hoodies and stickers and all sorts of stuff at Ominous, and I think all that stuff is on the Ominous website. We actually wanted to do a statue, wanted to do a Dreadstar statue, and Paul Harding, who is a buddy of mine and also just an amazing toy and statue designer, he works for DC and Sideshow and Gentle Giant and virtually everybody out there, Tweeterhead. Paul did a great sculpt of Dreadstar, and we offered it as part of the Kickstarter for the Dreadstar Omnibus. But we just didn't get enough. We didn't get enough orders on it to make it commercially viable, because obviously once you decide to produce a statue, you're talking about manufacturing in Asia and getting it shipped over, and we just didn't get the number of orders that we wanted that would have made it financially feasible to do even a short run of statues. So maybe somewhere down the road, we've still got this amazing looking design, and hopefully we can get that to market at some point.
That makes sense.
That's incredible. I highly recommend to the audience to check out the Dreadstar Omnibus. It's so good. It's just so well. It's just so beautiful to look at.
And he's got his own voice too, which is, as a character, very unique. Because you look at him and you're thinking, okay, he looks like Oliver Queen, but I get more of like a John Carter of Marz vibe from it. It's really a different voice than what I'm used to seeing.
To a great extent, Dreadstar is Jim. I mean, he sort of looks like Jim, and I know when Jim was doing the painted artwork that he initially did in the 80s when it was part of the Epic Illustrated, Jim used himself as the photo model for the painted pages for Dreadstar. So, certainly the apple didn't fall far from the tree there. Dreadstar is very much Jim's other child besides Thanos.
I think, didn't he say in the foreword to the book, he said that, anytime someone came into the office, he'd make them pose for him as one of the characters. And he realized since Dreadstar is the main character of the book, he might as well pick the most reliable person, which is him. He's going to always be there.
He knew he was always going to be there. Exactly.
That's great. That's awesome. So, Ron, have you ever had a chance to meet Stan Lee?
I met Stan back in the 90s at one of the early in my career Marvel Christmas parties. I believe it was at the Grand Central Hotel in New York, and this was when the boom time was on in comics, and Marvel was making money hand over fist because everybody was making money hand over fist in comics. Everything was selling in the hundreds of thousands of copies. Like when I took over Silver Surfer, my first gig in comics, we were selling 300,000 copies an issue.
Wow.
It was just a crazy time in the business. And obviously, eventually the bottom dropped out. But for a while there, it was some pretty, the troughs were full for a few years. And Marvel had a really amazing holiday party that year. And with like life-size ice sculptures of some of the characters and this insanely huge, bountiful buffet laid out with, it was, this huge, display and buffet that was topped by, I think, three ice sculptures. It was a lavish party. It was amazing. And that's where I met Stan. I was introduced to Stan because he was there to play Stan Lee. He was there to, be a party favor basically. And so, obviously everybody wanted to meet Stan, and I got my chance to meet Stan, and Stan knew who I was. I was stunned, or at least he convinced me he knew who I was. And, like he said, "Oh, I love what you're doing on Silver Surfer. It's a great job. That's my favorite character."
Yeah.
Wow.
Which was cool. Like, right. I didn't need to take the train home. I just floated.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, to have the creator of the character just give you praise for that. You got to have floated home after that.
Well, and, I think in point of fact, Jack Kirby was the creator of the character. And, the story that I've always heard is that Jack put the Silver Surfer in and Stan didn't know who he was. Stan was like, "Well, what's this guy?" And he's like, "Well, that's the herald of God, because, God doesn't speak to people. He's got somebody else that does that for him." That's the apocryphal story that I've always heard.
Interesting.
But then, in a weird way, obviously Stan very much made the Surfer his own, and sort of, in his philosophical bent, Stan was very much, using the Surfer to get his more philosophical ideas out there.
Right.
And certainly the Surfer ended up being his favorite character for sure. The Buscema stuff, and then obviously that Mobius series in the 80s, or the Mobius Harder in the 80s, which is just one of the most amazing looking books I've ever seen.
That's right.
Requiem was a really good book too. If I want to say it was like J. Michael Straczynski that wrote that, but that was a really good one.
Right. Yeah, it's a very cool character because you can do a lot with him as well. I mean, you can do sort of standard superhero stuff, but you can also do more philosophical stuff with the Surfer. And I was very blessed to start my career working with Ron Lim, who was the consummate professional and just a terrific artist. And I learned a huge amount just working with him.
That's great. When you go into these companies to write the characters that have been around for so long, Do you have a certain approach? Like, do you feel like especially like a Silver Surfer, for example, you're like, oh, I got to make sure this is just right because, and you already walk in with a knowledge of kind of who the character is. Do you find it not challenging but intimidating? At least when you first start.
Honestly, no. I have, I have enough probably unearned confidence that I don't get intimidated by stuff. I just go in and, I know how to do the job, so let me do it. So, I think that probably has something to do with the fact that, when I was 18, I was working for a daily newspaper and being treated as a professional, and also learning that you couldn't please everybody. Like, no matter what you did, there were going to be people complaining about what you did. So I very early on developed, a thick skin about just do what you're going to do. I mean, tell the story that you want to tell within the boundaries that your publisher gives you or the editor allows you. Just tell the story that you want to read, and the rest of it kind of takes care of itself.
That's awesome. Is there an artist that you haven't worked with yet, but you would love to?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a list as long as my arm. I've been blessed to work with, any number of just amazing artists. It's, the story that you write is only as good as the person who draws it. And I've been very lucky to work with so many. But I think two of the people that I've never worked with that are just on the top of my wish list, or that will probably never happen, but because they certainly don't need me, they can write their own damn stories, is Mike Mignola and Lee Weeks.
Oh, nice.
Oh, fantastic choices.
Yeah, they're just two of the absolute best, and both really sweet guys too. I know Mike has a reputation of being kind of a curmudgeon, and he is, but he's also a really good dude.
That's awesome.
I met Lee, and we talked about Red Sox baseball for like 45 minutes. It was amazing. He's a big baseball fan.
Lee's a baseball guy and a magic guy. He does magic tricks too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he does sleight of hand stuff.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What about characters? Is there a character that you have yet to write that you're dying to do?
I've really ended up writing virtually everybody, at least for a guest appearance here or there. Like because of Marvel versus DC.
Oh yeah.
I've written like everybody for at least a panel or two. Even like two of my favorite characters are Doctor Strange and Dr. Fate. I would love to write each of them, but I wrote them together, so maybe I don't need to write them separately.
That's so much fun.
My answer to this is always, and even though I've written the character before, is my one unfulfilled ambition in comics is I would love to write a monthly Tarzan book.
Ooh, that'd be great. There's
such a great history of Tarzan in comics that I would really love to scratch that itch on a monthly basis. Even though I know it's a character that is not as in vogue, certainly as in its heyday, but I'm still really drawn to the sort of fantasy Africa that those stories inhabit, and the kind of more fantastical nature of the character.
Well, that's awesome. I would be there. I'd buy the first issue off the rack.
I was a big fan of the Voodoo book that you had done.
Yeah, well, it just it didn't quite work out like anybody expected.
Yeah,
and I think there was ultimately probably some miscommunication as to what I was going to do and what kind of book they ended up getting, because I felt like they asked me if I wanted to do the book, and I was kind of like, well, what do you want? And they said, we don't really know what we want. We want something maybe sort of like the TV show Alias, kind of spy stuff. But other than that, we have no real strong direction.
It seemed like a really good premise. And the art was great. So
yeah, I mean, I enjoyed doing it, but it ended up not being what they wanted.
Yeah.
So I wrote it, and right in my pitch for it was like, if I do my job correctly, the half of the audience for the book will think Voodoo is the hero of the book, and half of the audience will think she's the villain of the book.
Huh.
So that's how I wrote it. I wanted her to sort of walk that gray area between those two extremes. And after the first issue came out, I got a call from DC, and they said, the editor-in-chief doesn't know who he's rooting for in this book.
That's great.
And I was like, yeah, exactly. they go, no, we can't have that. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, that's how the whole book is set up now. So, so eventually, I wasn't giving them what they wanted, and I certainly didn't know what they wanted because they didn't know what they wanted. So we just ended up parting ways, and I feel bad about it. I actually liked the issues that I did quite a bit, but it ended up getting, like I said, it ended up being one of those things that was neither fish nor fowl. It wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what they wanted. So it just didn't hit the mark for anybody.
Wow. Unbelievable. Was it a tough decision turning Hal Jordan into Parallax?
It wasn't really my decision. It was DC's decision.
Oh, okay.
DC had the basics, like a page and a half of notes for what they wanted Emerald Twilight to be. So that basic storyline was in place already. So all the details and how it was executed and all that was all me. But the broad strokes of that storyline, kind of Hal losing his shit and going into the power battery and coming out as a different character, that was all the basic premise that was handed to me. Darryl Banks is actually the one that came up with the name Parallax, which was a perfect name.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That laid the groundwork for so much. Like, the entire Jeff Johns run could not have happened without what you made.
Sure. Well, look, any of us stand on the shoulders of all the people who came before us. And I got to do what I did before because of all the Green Lantern creators that had come before. And then the people who came after me, picked up the torch, no pun intended, from what we did. And, I was really, DC just let us run with the concept and the character for quite a long time. And really, really stood behind the decision to, let's have a new character in the starring role.
That's great. That's amazing. Ron, it's been awesome here. Justin, do you have any further questions for Ron today?
The only question I could really ask is Green Lantern related. Are you a fan of the 2011 movie there, The Green Lantern? Because it seemed like he was a good cross of Hal and some other things, but he wasn't like a true Hal. What's your take on that film?
I've actually never seen it all the way through.
Okay.
I've seen bits and pieces of it, and I don't know that it works as well as anybody wanted it to. And I think there were probably some script issues, and I think it was not exactly. I mean, to me, Hal works best as sort of that Chuck Yeager, Daredevil test pilot archetype. And I don't know that Ryan Reynolds was the right guy for that role. And obviously he's just the perfect guy for Deadpool. So
yeah,
a lot of it comes down to casting. And if you don't hit the mark on that stuff, it makes the whole assignment tougher. I think that's one of the reasons that Marvel's movies have been so good, is that they almost get the casting right almost every time.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm with you on that one. And then my last question for you is just whose voice do you hear when you read a specific character like Batman or something? Do you have like a go-to in your head, or do you hear something all different?
Not really. I just those are all like comic book characters. Are just comic book characters to me. Like, I don't hear anybody's specific voice. I mean, maybe Kevin Conroy for Batman, since his voice is so identifiable and so good.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like, I read these characters and started reading these characters and writing these characters long before there was anybody had a voice attached to it, right? Like, so Captain America doesn't sound like Chris Evans to me. He just sounds like Captain America.
He sounds like Reb Brown.
Yeah, I don't think anybody gives that answer. So yeah, I don't really voice cast anybody. I mean, maybe, like I said, maybe Conroy for Batman and maybe Christopher Reeve for Superman, because that had a big impact on me as a kid.
Right.
But other than that, I just, I always approach them as how I sort of read them when I was a kid.
It's funny that you said that, Justin, because when I was rereading Batman Aliens, without even realizing it, I was probably about 3 or 4 pages in. I realized that I was hearing Kevin Conroy's voice in my head.
I go back and forth between Conroy and Bruce Greenwood.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Well, I tend to write Batman as quietly as possible. Like I don't know that I've ever used an exclamation point for Batman, unless he's getting punched or something like that. Because my version of Batman just never raises his voice because he doesn't have to.
Right.
I like a Batman who does not say much and does not raise his voice just because, he scares the crap out of you just by speaking.
Right. Do you have any plans to, or have you, and maybe we missed it, have you worked on any animation for either company, or do you have plans to?
I have not. It's a interesting thing because J.M. DeMatteis, who obviously has a storied comics career and actually lives in Kingston, New York. He lives in my hometown now.
Wow.
Like J.M. has moved into doing a lot of the animation stuff for DC and writing a number of the films. And it's always been sort of interesting, an interesting direction to go in. But I've just never had the opportunity. And, there's always been enough comics work to keep me busy.
That's interesting. Well, Ron, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. And can you tell our listeners what books you've got out currently that they should be looking for and where they can find you online?
Find me online on Twitter, mostly at Ron Marz. There's a Ron Marz Comics Facebook page, but I don't maintain it. Somebody else does, and I get messages from it. But Twitter's the one where that gets my attention every day. And my website is in dire need of an update. But that's there too. And let's see, I just did Andy Lanning and I co-wrote the Endless Winter crossover for DC in December, which was a Justice League event across 9 books. And Andy and I are working on something, 2 other things actually right now, with the other as co-writers that have not been announced, so I can't tell you what they are. And there's the sequel to Beast of the Black Hand, which is almost done. That's ready to go to press in a few weeks for Ominous Press. And let's see, I should know all of this stuff off the top of my head, but there's a number of things that haven't been announced yet. My serial Swamp God is going to be in Heavy Metal magazine. There'll be a separate heavy metal comic series called World Traveler that I'm doing, and other stuff that I guess will be announced later this year that I'm working on now. Thankfully working on a bunch of stuff because there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. So I just sit here and work every day.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And, feel free to come back on the show whenever you want to promote a new project or maybe even just talk comics with us.
Sounds good, guys. It was a pleasure. I like doing this stuff, especially right now, because this is the connection that we can have. Hopefully later this year, we can all start to get together in buildings with each other again. But for now, this is what we've got. So I hope everybody's safe and healthy and making the best of it. And, in a few months, we're on the other side of this.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Ron.
Thanks, guys. Everybody take care. We'll do it again.
Okay. Well, Justin, that was amazing. Well, I mean, what a guy, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. He had some great questions there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he had some. He just had so many good stories. It just kept, things just kept coming to mind.
Yeah, I was not aware of the Deepak Chopra book on that. That's a great one, and I gotta probably look for that on Comixology now.
Yeah. There you go. So, Justin, once again, thank you for joining us here on the show. And can you give our listeners your contact online information?
Yeah, the best place you could find me is there is a podcast, Epic Tales from the Sewers, which is all based on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics and various artists and writers that we've spoken with. You could check me out there. The Fantastic Podcast. You could find me on Instagram. You can find me on Twitter or on Facebook in the Epic Shells Facebook group.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on again, and I look forward to having you on the show in the future.
Thanks, sir.
Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today with comic book author Ron Marz. I highly recommend that you go out and read as much of his work as you possibly can. You won't be able to put it down. Please tell us what you thought about today's episode. You can send your feedback to thenisnow42@gmail.com. You can also join in the conversation at our Facebook Then Is Now podcast group. Then Is Now podcast is a proud member of the Dorkening Podcast Network, so be sure to check out the other great shows there at thedorkening.com. You can also visit our website at havenpodcasts.com, where you'll find our sister show, The East Meets the West, in which we discuss Shaw Brothers films and spaghetti western movies. And Then Is Now is on YouTube, so visit youtube.com/user/UncleDeath1 to get the latest videos as well as other fun videos. Please subscribe to our YouTube page and also share the video versions of our podcast with your friends and get them to subscribe as well. Don't forget to go wherever you download your podcast from and leave us a great review so that more listeners can find us. We are on all the podcasting apps, especially the big three, iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Class dismissed.
This Now podcast is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. Sounds, music, and clips played during this podcast are the property of their copyright holders. All original content is copyright Jupiter Media.
For more shows like the one you just heard, check out the Dorkening Podcast Network at thedorkening.com.